Here we are with Captain Bill Canning, Sedgwick House, 1944 to 1948, MBE, DSO, former captain of HMS Broadsword. Welcome to Sedbergh School and thank you for agreeing to be interviewed today.
Thank you for the honour.
And so you were here during the war period. Can you describe what that was like?
It was different, of course. The war had been on for 4 years or more since before we arrived. Of course it was different. There was food rationing, there was travel difficulties, but it didn't seem to affect life here at Sedbergh as far as we could see, and we thoroughly enjoyed it, my two brothers and I.
That's interesting you say it didn't affect you. So presumably there was quite a lot of austerity, not just with food, was there?
Yes, but we didn't notice it because we were living in the south of England where it was fairly austere anyway, so life just carried on here. We were given a rasher of bacon and an egg and a bit of butter and a bit of cheese each week, and we got on with it. Nothing new.
And what about heating and fuel supplies? Did you have those here?
I don't remember any problems. Sedbergh was always a hardy place, and you were aware of the cold from time to time, but it didn't seem to us to be particularly cold because we expected it. There was central heating, I'm sure. And
so you had, presumably there were casualties, were they read out each week or so?
No, not that I recall, and I think I would have recalled, not at all, no.
No, that's interesting, because I think in the First World War they certainly did so.
Well, of course, they were prodigiously high in number at that time.
No, indeed, indeed. Now, of course, during this time you won the Wilson Run. Can I ask you, what was your motivation to make you such a good runner?
We all did it. I suppose being modestly built and reasonably fleet of foot. I did do a bit of athletics before I came here, but nothing more than a couple of miles, I suppose. And because it was here, and we were here, one did it. I took part in the 3, again, as we mostly did. I was second in the 3, beaten just by Brian Exley at the finishing line. So one, in the normal course, just moved on under the direction of Housemaster Piddly Ward to train up for the 10.
And does the Wilson Run still mean a lot to you?
Oh, yes. Well, that's being immodest, but of course it does, yes.
Yeah, and it does hold a special place in Sedberghians' hearts. Why do you think that is?
Well, if you read the paperwork, Sedbergh stands for rugby and fell running. And occasionally it's the other way around, that the annual major event is the Wilson Run. I never quite got my head around that, because rugby, to my mind, was what Sedbergh was all about. But yes, it's well up the list, and it was a great privilege to take part, and even more so. Mind you, of course, there was nobody else running that year, so it was easy. And of course, we had the weather for it. And that particular year, 1948, it was extremely warm, and lovely and dry, and not a problem.
Am I right in thinking the previous years when we had the big snows?
Yes.
Yeah.
Cancelled.
Yes. Oh, right, of course. Yes. Yeah. Now, you went from Sedbergh School. Did you go straight into the Navy?
I did, yes. Left here in July 48 and joined the Navy in September, I think it was, that year, at Dartmouth.
And your father, I think, was in the military?
He was Army, regular Army. My younger brother was later to become a regular soldier, and my twin brother became a National Service sailor. So military was in our blood.
And that's what made you go into the Navy?
Well, I always wanted to join the Navy, and I think that goes back to living in Malta between 1934 and 1939, where my father was stationed. All we saw were His Majesty's ships going in and out of Grand Harbour or Sleamer Creek, and I'm quite sure that was what motivated me. I never varied after that.
And now, while you're in the Navy, you served on Her Majesty's yacht Britannia.
Yeah.
Could you describe your time there?
Yes, it was a great treat, of course. It's not something you volunteer to do. Some chap elsewhere with a pen and a sheet of paper pricked out your name. But I was serving in a frigate based on the west coast of Scotland at the time, when my captain sent for me and said, "You've been invited to go and present yourself for interview aboard the Royal Yacht." So I went down and I met several, including Jock Slater, and we went down and we were interviewed by the commander, who was the second in command, and the admiral, to make sure we ate our beans off the right side of the knife and this sort of thing. So it was a huge surprise. I wasn't quite sure what to make of it at the time of my appointment, but it was a great privilege, and one enjoyed it. It was different from the Navy, quite different.
Did you meet the royal family while you were on board?
Oh yes, dined next to the Queen and Prince Philip and the Queen Mother and various members of the royal family. What happened was, at sea, if the weather was fine, 4 officers from the officers' mess, the wardroom, would go down and join the royal party on board for a very informal dinner round a table for about 12 people. And there was back chat and joking, and one was very, very apprehensive, I was, although we'd been well briefed, and you were told that if you were sitting on the right of the Queen, she would talk to you, I think it was, for the first course, and the next course she would talk to the other officer on her left, so that you could talk to the Dowager Marchioness of whatnot on your right, who was a member of the royal household. So it was quite well formulated, but it made one very apprehensive. And you watched your P's and Q's with great care. And of course the other problem was, the Queen would eat her food quite quickly and be served first. You were served last, so you were halfway through your supper before it was cleared away.
Oh, did they clear away because she'd finished?
More or less.
Oh, I see.
Not quite like that, but it was a bit.
Because I know with Queen Victoria that was the rule, wasn't it?
Absolutely, yes. Yeah.
And what was Queen Elizabeth like?
Well, of course, in those days, I'm going back to 1961, she was midway through her career. She was a naturally formal lady in public, but she went out of her way to make you feel as comfortable as possible. Not quite as much as the Queen Mum, who was delightful. She wanted to know about your children and where they went to school and who your nanny was and all that sort of thing. But the Queen, yes, she put you at her ease as best she could. But you were tensed up here.
And as an international statesperson, how did she come across?
The what?
As a statesperson.
Those on board, do you mean? Well, one didn't mix a great deal. The one we were most apprehensive of was Prince Philip, who said anything and went where he shouldn't on board. He's never strictly allowed on the bridge, because the royals had their own bridge lower down. And Prince Philip would wander up on the bridge, and you just had to put up with him. And he'd go to the chart and say, "Where are we?" I said, "There, sir." "You sure?" "Yes, sir." do you want to see the results of my sunsight or something? I mean, he meant well, but he had a pretty abrasive manner, as you probably know.
Yes. So, and I think you've been back recently to see the ship?
Yesterday.
And how did you feel?
Well, it was, to be absolutely honest, not too good. Finding it, for a start, was a challenge. And having got there, she is so different now. Everything's the walkway that you tack between the decks is all enclosed. You don't get a feel for the ship at all. And there are a lot of people wandering around with a commentary on their phone.
Bill, after Her Majesty's yacht Britannia, you then, I think, joined other ships such as HMS Norfolk, but then eventually you were assigned to HMS Broadsword. Can you describe that period in your life?
Indeed I can, for a variety of reasons. A, she was to be my last appointment in the Navy, because I knew that I was retiring. That's the way the Navy does it. They either tell you that your chances of becoming an admiral are good, possible, or nil. Surprise, surprise, they told me mine were nil. So I joined the ship, and we had a lovely program lined up with about 9 months in the Far East. My wife was going to join me in Singapore, I think it was, and we were going to have a lovely day. We were going to do some work as well and some exercises, but there was a ship. She was also the squadron leader of that class of ship, the Type 22, a brand new frigate full of electronics and computers, which I didn't understand, but had people who did. So it was a very pleasant challenge.
And so you took command, I think, in October 1981, and then on the 2nd of April 1982, the Falklands were invaded.
Yes.
And what happened with HMS Broadsword?
We were already with the home fleet exercising west of Gibraltar, and there were about 15 or 20 ships. We knew what was bubbling up in the South Atlantic and listened with pretty keen interest, of course. And then eventually, before the invasion by the Argentinians of the islands, a task force had been formed in embryo, except HMS Broadsword. We were going out to the Far East. And I could not believe, because of my squadron of 4 ships, only 2 were in that exercise period, HMS Brilliant and my own ship Broadsword. And we, Broadsword, were going to carry on to the Far East, whilst the rest of the fleet was preparing for war, and we were the latest thing. But sail we did, and the task force formed up and left Gibraltar and went south. We toddled westerly, and I told my navigator, who you called Pilot, I said, I want to go as slowly as we can, yet maintain our rendezvous through Suez Canal, which was planned. We had with us a fleet tanker and a frigate under my jurisdiction. So having sailed earlier that morning, I think it was, about midnight, I got a signal saying, in effect, oops, go back to jib. And my instructions were to pick up any stores that I thought might be useful, and then hurry along and join up the task force. So that's what we did. Went back to jib. The army were marvelous. The battalion commander came down to meet us at the jetty and said, would you like some machine guns? So I said, yes, thank you very much. So he brought 8 general purpose machine guns down as their contribution. And we fueled, picked up a few stores, and then set off in pursuit of the task force.
Of course, I remember those times because I was still at school here. And I remember how Britain prepared so quickly.
Yes. Oh, yes.
And do you think they could do that today?
No.
That's a worry.
Sorry, I shouldn't say that, but
well,
I mean, I really don't believe we could. We haven't got the facilities, the resources, or the willpower, in my view. But here we were, off to defend a bit of British soil, and even the dockyard workers were behind us. So I really don't think we could do it now today.
And that's a shame, isn't it? That's
awful. Yeah, crime.
And I think that in your day, there was a good deal more people in the Navy than there are today.
Oh, yes. I should remember, and cannot, just how many frigates and destroyers there were down there. It was probably about 24 or 5. Now I gather there are 9 in the entire fleet that are operational. That gives a picture of our capability at present.
And of course we had our aircraft carriers down there.
We had 2 aircraft carriers.
Yes.
An old-fashioned one, the Hermes, more than adequate, and a little one, brilliant, the Harrier carrier. And we had quite a complement of aircraft, mostly Fleet Air, but with some from the Royal Air Force. Their Harrier was a little different in that it was ground attack as opposed to air-to-air combat. So we were, I ought to remember the number of Harriers we could muster. So yes, we were fairly self-contained, and I'll come on to this later, for open water warfare.
Yeah. Now, HMS Broadsword is remembered for its action, I think, partly in defending HMS Coventry. Could you describe that day to me?
Yes. I'll be a little bit long-winded about it, but the landings took place on the 21st of May, at which time I had 7 ships under my operational command to defend Falklands Sound and try and protect it from air attack by the very brave Argentine Air Force. And we were not very successful, simply because we were landlocked. Our excellent radar, which could pick up an attack 200 miles away, couldn't do so. You saw it visually 3 or 4 miles away, and we got clobbered. And by the end of that first day, there were 3 of my ships which were virtually unscathed, only 3. The others had unexploded bombs on board or cannon fire damage and were not fully operational. And we endured another day on the 22nd of May, but the Argentinians themselves were reeling a bit and didn't press home much by way of attack that day. And I sat down in my cabin that evening. The Argies didn't fight by night, by and large. They didn't have that capability. I'm sure they had the willpower, but not the capability. So I sat down and drafted it, or wrote a signal to Admiral Sandy Woodward, who was the task force commander, who I knew very well. I was older than him. I had been senior to him as a captain, so I felt I could take the gloves off a bit. So I said, Sandy, no I didn't, I said, sir, I'm sure, by signal, I feel we are not going to win this war landlocked here in Falklands Sound. What I think we should do is, if you would be willing to send me an air defense ship of the type of Coventry, a Type 42 destroyer. The Type 22, my ship, was an anti-submarine ship, but designed specifically to defend another ship with you, a capital ship with you. Short-range missile system, an anti-missile missile system. So I said, what we'll do is we will go north into the open sea, north of West Falkland, and we can interdict the raids coming in with Coventry's long-range radar and her long-range missile system. And if by any accident one came towards it, I would deal with it with Sea Wolf. Okay, he said, off you go. And was good enough to say, make your own plans and do what you think is best. And so on the 23rd of May, we went out there. It was a very quiet day. Coventry shot down a couple of helicopters carrying Argentinian troops, as I later learnt. And the 24th was quite a quiet day. There still were raids going into San Carlos. What they do is they take off, fly high from Argentina, drop low and approach West Falkland at low level, and then skim over the ground and attack the base in San Carlos. And we didn't have a lot of success. On the 25th, at about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, we were keeping Greenwich Mean Time for tactical reasons. Coventry reported another raid coming in at high level, and then we lost it as it went low, and at about 12 to 15 miles it reappeared, heading towards West Falkland, but this time turned north towards us. We were 500 yards apart. And furthermore, they split it, the 2 pairs of 4 A4 aircraft split. The first lot came towards us, and the Seawolf weapon system only engages its target at about at a hitting range of 8 kilometers maximum. So it's white of eye stuff. And there we were, Coventry and Broadsword, 500 yards apart, with this pair coming in apparently at us rather than Coventry. And they released, Coventry had a missile system failure. And at about the time that my Seawolf system should have been squirting off missiles, the computer shut down. The missile system trained 4.5, and that was that. They released 4 bombs. My officer of the watch up on the bridge, I was in the operations room, said if I'd been standing up, I could have touched them. The fourth bounced off the sea about 150 yards from the ship, and then climbed out rather like a dam buster bomb, came in through the side, down the stern, still without going off, came out through the flight deck, through a Lynx helicopter carrying 2 live torpedoes, and carried on over the side without going off. So I was trying to comprehend what the hell was going on in that brief interval. And then in my other ear, my tactical ear, I heard aircraft, Red 30 or something. This was the other pair coming in, directly at Coventry, on the other side of Coventry, at low level from me, so that even if we'd had Seawolf working, we couldn't have done anything about it.
And you're just describing you're on HMS Broadsword in conjunction with HMS Coventry, and you have 2 Argentinian planes coming towards you.
The second pair, the first pair had passed over the top and gone on their way. The second pair headed straight for Coventry. I remember saying to my poor old opposite number, David Hart Dyke in Coventry, manoeuvre as you require to bring your weapon systems to bear, but it was all a bit too late. They released 4 bombs at Coventry, 3 of which hit, and at least 2 went off, with devastating results in that within 31 minutes she was upside down, and all but the 18 of her fatal casualties were either in the sea or jumping into it in their preservation suits. Not a good moment. The dilemma at that time for me was, what do I do about Coventry? And the answer, very simply, is ignore them. Get yourself sorted out for the next raid that I felt sure was bound to come to finish us off. And that would have been a 13-0 win for the Argentinians, which was just not contemplatable. So I told my ship's company that's what I was going to do. All this happened quite quickly, of course. And I told my weapons engineer staff that they've got to get Seawolf back online. They said, we've got it, we've done it already. So we left the Coventry boys where they were, some in life rafts, many swimming in their survival suits, and we moved off a little way up threat, as they call it, in the direction from which I thought any further attack might come. Not far away, half a mile at the most. And I then made a signal. I broke all the rules. I had my computer radar picture in front of me was all dancing, all singing. I picked up a high-frequency radio transmitter, the transmission of which could be heard in Adelaide, London, Argentina, Paris, or wherever, worldwide. And I very briefly described what had happened, guessing that it was pretty likely that my admiral, 200 miles away in the Hermes, would hear. And I said, Coventry was, in plain English, because time was of the essence, I said, Coventry is sunk or sinking, and we need help immediately. What I asked for specifically was a Harrier combat air patrol, a pair of Harriers, to fly overhead to ward off any further Argentinian attack. Now, it so happened that the captain of Hermes, one Linley Middleton, South African, I knew very well, a great friend of mine, and his son was one of my 2 helicopter pilots. And I think this had an added urgency to my message, because a pair of Harriers, which was already sitting on deck at 1 minute's notice to fly, probably, was scrambled immediately. And but 200 miles away. But within 6 or 7 minutes, 8 minutes maybe, along came a pair of Harriers led by Lieutenant Commander Robin Kent. Another detail which I remember clearly, and once they had arrived, I reckon my problems were largely over and that we could go back and concentrate on recovering the Coventry survivors. More importantly, our senior chap in San Carlos, another old friend of mine, Commodore Mike Clapp, he also heard my broadcast. Oh, everybody heard it. he included. And he sent out 10 Sea King helicopters, 10, to help with the recovery. All we had was a couple of small boats, and there were 250 odd chaps in swimming or in boats. And so the helicopters came out and they did a super job picking up the survivors. They also knew where the hospital ship was, which by international law I wasn't supposed to know, and I didn't know, but she was about 20 miles away. So they were picking up survivors, and the badly injured they were taking straight to the Uganda, the hospital ship. The others, they came, hovered over the forecastle Broadsword and lowered them down on board, picking them out of life rafts or fishing them out of the sea directly. And that operation took quite a long time. It must have taken a couple of hours. It was getting dark. The Harriers were running short of fuel, and Coventry had sunk out of sight. And one of the last people to be brought on board was the captain of the Coventry, David Hart Dyke, father of Miranda Hart. And he was brought, I was by then up on the bridge, and they brought David up to see me, and I looked at him and he was wet, shivering, burnt. And I wondered what the hell you say to him when you have failed to defend him for whatever reason. So I said, David, I'm terribly sorry. Would you like a hot bath? Not quite in those terms, but, and he nodded. I don't think he said anything. He nodded and it was ushered away to have a hot bath. By then, we were fairly clear that anybody living, or indeed had died, had been recovered. And I think I was ordered to, even if I hadn't already decided, we would return to San Carlos, where the rest of the force was, to disembark these chaps. It was by then totally dark, and having set off, I went down to the officers' mess in Broadsword, the wardroom, to see all these poor old Coventry survivors, a couple of hundred of them, I suppose, sitting here, there, and everywhere. And I had a brief word of apology, and the captain was up in my cabin. And they couldn't have been nicer or more grateful for the fact that we'd been there to fish them out of the sea. And off we went to San Carlos. We arrived there at something like 1 in the morning, pitch dark. Everything was dark, there were no lights anywhere. And Mike Clapp, the Commodore, told me that he'd organised a tank landing ship or something to come alongside and take off the Coventry survivors. So having dropped an anchor, this craft came along. We disembarked all the Coventry survivors, and as they pulled away, they raised 3 cheers, and I thought, my God, if ever there was a gallant notion for somebody who'd been abandoned in the sea, I thought it was very moving. So they having gone, they having raised their 3 cheers, what did we do? I think we raised the anchor and went off to a safer berth or something. And that really was the end of that particular saga, because the next day the Coventry survivors were all moved to one of the merchant ships down there and taken home, including David Hart Dyke. We got patched up where the whole war. Fortunately, the weather was fine. Otherwise, we'd have had water slopping in through the back end, which would have been a bit of a problem. But the repair unit that the Navy had down there with them in San Carlos, came on board and stuck on a couple of plates, and we were back more or less to normal.
So can I ask you, during that sort of period when you're being attacked, how do you stay calm?
How did
you stay calm or keep a cool head?
Did I?
Well, I hope so.
Well, difficult to answer that, John. There's a lot to think about and do. I'm a very simple fellow. I think that's all it is. And I thought, what the hell does one do now? Pick up my phone and say, help, and try and reassure your chaps that you were fully in charge. I like to think I was, but I'm not sure. I can't answer it. Simplicity. Simple fellow.
Fair enough. Do you think you obviously have resilience after what you went through, but do you think any of that came from your schooling, your time here at Sedbergh?
I think very probably it did. We had no airs and graces here. Black was black, white was white. We got on with the job. We did by and large what we were told to do, and we were left to think for ourselves. For example, if we wanted to go off for a little walk, or a long walk somewhere, we would tell Housemaster Piddly Ward that we were going to go X, Y, Z. He said, "Okay, fine. What time will you be back?" So one was made to think here. So the answer to your question is yes, unquestionably.
So Bill, what would you say to somebody who wants to join the military today?
First of all, I would say that the military is a super career for anybody because it teaches you self-discipline and to think about others and plan ahead and all those things. And you can't teach courage, but you learn about courage by listening to what others have to say. And so the short answer is yes. The longer answer, I suppose, and the slightly sensitive one, is that I'm not that confident that we offer quite the career that I was able to enjoy in my time. Why? Because the forces are so small in number and shape. And I think much of today's society does not actually train you for life in the services. So it's a mixed answer, Jan, and I'm sorry I can't answer it black and white, but yes in one hand, no in the other.
Now, if I can ask you, what are your top tips for doing well in such a structured institution?
As the Navy?
As a Navy, indeed.
Doing what you're told, listening, being human to other human beings, and those of my generation could quote quite a few where the officers' treatment of their men was way below what I expect to be the standard. Okay, you've got to be firm. You've got to make sure that you could say that you're asking them to do what you yourself would be prepared to do if you possibly have the training to do it. So only get them to do what you would be prepared to do yourself. Treat them firmly but kindly, fairly but firmly. And look the part, I suppose. All very simple.
Indeed. So my last question, actually. Sedbergh School. Sedbergh School has done very well, and it's done very well for 500 years. What do you think is the key to its success?
Outward bound, lack of restriction, good treatment. I remember no bullying whatever in Sedgwick House in 44 to 48. I really don't. And I'm not aware of bullying or improper treatment in other houses. So I think it's the environment of Sedbergh, the outward bound spirit, the freedom of movement, and good teaching, good leading.
Captain Bill Canning, MBE, DSO, Captain of HMS Broadsword, and Sedgwick House 1944 to 1948. Thank you very much.